The morning sun cast long shadows across Hollister Air Force Base, located in the rolling hills of rural Northern California. Captain Sarah Chen stood in the briefing room, her dark hair pulled back in a tight military bun, her flight suit hanging loose over her lean frame. She had logged over 2,000 flight hours in the A-10 Thunderbolt, but the men in this room still looked at her the same way they had on her first day, as if she didn't belong. "Gentlemen," the squadron commander, Colonel Marcus Webb, said as he clicked through the mission briefing. He was a tall man with a crisp voice and crueler eyes. "Today's patrol over the valley is routine, simple surveillance, nothing complicated." Sarah watched the tactical map display on the screen. The assignment was standard, a 2-hour sweep over the designated zone, checking for any irregular activity. She had flown this route 40 times before. "Captain Chen," Webb continued, not looking at her, "you'll be flying with Lieutenant Parker as your wingman. Keep it simple, come back home." There was something in the way he said, "keep it simple," that made Sarah's jaw tighten. She had heard it before in different ways from different mouths. The implication was always the same. Don't do anything that might prove you're capable of more than we think you are. When the briefing ended, the other pilots filed out with the casual confidence of men who had never been made to feel small in their own profession. Sarah gathered her helmet and gear slowly, methodically checking everything twice. She always did. Lieutenant Frank Parker, a blonde-haired pilot with a cocky smile, stopped by her locker. "Hell of an assignment today, right?" he said, grinning. 2 hours babysitting the hills, perfect job for." He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to, perfect job for her. The implication hung in the air between them like smoke. "See you in the air, Lieutenant," Sarah said quietly, her voice steady and professional. Flying had always been her escape. Her father was a mechanic in a small garage in Fresno, 60 miles south. Her mother had worked double shifts at a hospital to help pay for flying lessons when Sarah was 16. Her childhood home had been modest, a 2-bedroom bungalow on a street where everybody knew everybody's business. As a girl, Sarah had learned quickly that the world didn't make room for girls who reached too high. But in the air, there was no judgment. The physics didn't care about her gender. The throttle responded the same way to her hand as it did to any man's. The sky was neutral territory. She climbed into the A-10, feeling the familiar embrace of the cockpit settle around her. The canopy came down with its soft hiss of hydraulics. She ran through the startup checklist, her hands moving with practiced precision through the sequence she could probably perform blindfolded. "Hollister ground, Warthog 11 ready for taxi," she spoke into the radio, using the A-10's affectionate nickname. "Copy that, Warthog 11, cleared for taxi, runway 27. The plane rolled forward, its powerful engines rumbling beneath her. Beside her in formation came Parker in Warthog 12. She could imagine him up there, probably already thinking about the burger he'd get for lunch, assuming the flight would be as routine as Webb had suggested. Sarah had learned something in her 15 years of military service that she rarely shared with anyone. The world had a way of proving your worst expectations right if you let it. But if you stayed sharp, if you remained aware and prepared, sometimes you could catch it off guard. The weather report had mentioned low cloud cover developing in the northern sector around hour 2 of the flight. Minor turbulence expected, nothing serious. As the pair of A-10s lifted off the runway and turned north toward their assigned patrol zone, Sarah's eyes constantly scanned her instruments. The sky that morning was a brilliant blue, at least near the base. But in the distance, she could see the darker clouds gathering like a bruise. Below them, the California landscape unrolled in patches of green farmland, brown hills, and the thin line of Highway 99 cutting through the middle like a scar. For the first hour, the flight was exactly as described in the briefing: routine, uneventful, boring. Sarah and Parker maintained their patrol pattern, scanning the terrain, running through their surveillance procedures. She radioed in routine status reports, everything nominal. But as the second hour approached, Sarah noticed something on her instruments. A radar signature, faint but distinct. Commercial air traffic, probably, but it was moving in an odd pattern, coming in low and fast from the mountains to the northeast. "Warthog 12, you picking up that contact?" she radioed to Parker. There was a pause. "Yeah, I see it. Probably a civilian aircraft running low to avoid the weather, nothing to worry about." But Sarah was already adjusting her course. The contact was unusual enough that it warranted investigation. It was her job to be thorough. It was who she was. "Control, Warthog 1-1, she transmitted. "Investigating unidentified contact at bearing 315 from our current position, maintaining normal altitude." "Copy that, Warthog 1-1, came the response from the base. She pushed the throttle forward slightly, increasing airspeed. The A-10 responded eagerly, its twin turbofan engines growling with controlled power. Parker followed, though his radio transmission carried an edge of frustration. 1-1, this seems unnecessary. Weather's getting worse, too." Sarah didn't respond. She was already seeing what her radar had picked up. This wasn't a civilian aircraft. The flight signature was wrong. The speed pattern was wrong. The approach vector was wrong. This was military hardware, and it was moving in a way that suggested hostile intent. The clouds were thickening now, rolling in faster than the forecast had predicted. Sarah descended slightly to maintain visual contact with the terrain below. The sky around them shifted from bright blue to a murky gray-white. "Contact has dropped below radar horizon," Parker reported. "Probably landed in the mountains somewhere. We should head back." But Sarah could still see something. A glint of metal, barely visible through the lower clouds. She banked the A-10 harder, pushing into the cloud layer. 1-1, break off that approach," Parker said, his voice tighter now. "We're entering instrument weather. You're not on an approved vector." Sarah knew he was right. The clouds had become thick and disorienting. The visibility was deteriorating rapidly. Professional procedure called for her to break off and return to base. But something in her gut, that instinct that had kept her alive through 15 years of military service, told her this was important. This was why she was up here, not to be safe and routine, but to pay attention, to be the one who noticed things others didn't. "Just one more minute," she said. She pushed the A-10 lower, descending through the clouds. And that's when she saw it clearly. A sleek military aircraft, unmarked, landing on what looked like a private airstrip cut into the mountain valley. Not a civilian plane, not commercial traffic. 1-2, you see that?" she called to Parker. "Negative, I've got nothing. 1-1, I'm heading back, this is." But Sarah wasn't listening anymore. She was focused on the aircraft below, trying to get a clear image, trying to understand what she was looking at and why it was here. She was so focused on the ground that she almost didn't see the missile launch. It came up through the clouds without warning, trailing smoke and fire. The impact was instantaneous. Everything went white-hot. The entire world became noise and pain and the terrible sensation of falling. The last thing Captain Sarah Chen remembered was the sound of her own voice, crying out a mayday call into the radio, and then nothing but darkness. 800 miles away in the small town of Fresno, California, Sarah's mother sat at the kitchen table of the modest two-bedroom house where she had raised her daughter. Margaret Chen was 73 years old now, her hair silver, her hands marked by the years of nursing and care she had given to others. The morning sun came through the thin curtains, casting pale light across her coffee and the newspaper she wasn't really reading. Sarah had been promoted to captain 5 years ago. Margaret still had the photo from the ceremony in her bedroom, framed in glass. Sarah in her dress uniform, smiling that careful smile she did for cameras, the one that didn't quite reach her eyes. The knock on the door came at 10:47. Margaret would remember the exact time for the rest of her life. She had just glanced at the clock above the sink. 2 officers in dress uniforms stood on her doorstep. A man and a woman, both with the solemn expressions that Margaret's heart already knew how to read. She had worked in hospitals long enough to recognize the face that tragedy wore. "Mrs. Chen," the male officer said. His voice was gentle, practiced in its kindness. Margaret couldn't make herself invite them inside. She stood in the doorway, her hand on the frame, and let them tell her right there on the threshold, as if the interior of her own home couldn't contain words this large. Captain Sarah Chen had been lost over a mountainous region near Hollister Air Force Base during a routine patrol flight. Her aircraft had gone down. There had been no emergency beacon activation, no radio contact. Search and rescue teams had been deployed, but given the terrain and the weather conditions, the prospects were grim. She was classified as killed in action. Margaret heard the words, but they seemed to come from very far away, as if they were addressed to someone else. This couldn't be right. Sarah was careful. Sarah was smart. Sarah had done everything right her entire life. The officers explained the next steps. There would be an official funeral service, military honors. She would be contacted by a casualty assistance officer who would help coordinate everything. "Do you have other family members we should contact?" the female officer asked gently. Margaret's mind felt hollow. Her father, David Chen, I'll need to call him. They had been divorced for 17 years. David had started a new family down in Los Angeles. He hadn't attended Sarah's last promotion ceremony. After the officers left, Margaret sat back down at the kitchen table. The coffee had gone cold. The newspaper was still open to the crossword puzzle, half finished, the pen lying across an incomplete word. She didn't cry, not yet. Something in her had gone numb, as if the loss was too large to process, and so her mind simply refused to acknowledge it was real. The funeral service was held 10 days later at Hollister Air Force Base. It was a cloudy afternoon, and over 200 military personnel attended. Sarah's unit, pilots from other squadrons, maintenance crews, administrative staff, people Sarah had worked with, trained with, flown alongside. Margaret sat in the front row, wearing the black dress she had worn to her own mother's funeral 23 years before. She had pulled her hair back severely, applied makeup she didn't feel, and arranged her face into the expression of a woman bearing grief with dignity. On either side of her sat the officers from Sarah's squadron, and beside them, David Chen, who had flown up from Los Angeles that morning. He looked older than Margaret remembered. The years had lined his face in ways she hadn't been prepared for. The chaplain gave a eulogy about Sarah's service, her dedication, her commitment to the mission. It was generic enough that Margaret had the sickening sense it could have been written for any soldier who had died. She wanted someone to talk about the Sarah she knew, the girl who had dreams of flight and the courage to pursue them even when the world told her it wasn't for people like her. But that Sarah existed only in Margaret's memory now. The folded American flag was presented with ceremony, placed in Margaret's hands by Colonel Webb himself. He clasped her hand briefly and looked into her eyes. "Your daughter was a credit to the service," he said. "She served with honor." Margaret nodded, not trusting herself to speak. It wasn't until 3 weeks later, when the initial shock had worn off, and Margaret had begun the slow, painful work of sorting through Sarah's personal effects, that something began to nag at her. Sarah had left her laptop, her personal files, and a stack of letters in a small wooden box in her mother's house. Insurance documents, military pay stubs, and correspondence with other veterans. Margaret had found a notebook tucked into the side of the box, Sarah's handwriting on the pages. The last entry was dated 2 days before the mission. "They don't want me to be good. They want me to be quiet. There's a difference between being a pilot and being a woman pilot. They treat it like a condition I need to recover from. But I don't care anymore what they think. I know who I am. And if I ever get the chance to prove it, really prove it, I will. That's all that matters." Margaret read those words 3 times, her finger tracing the loops and curves of her daughter's familiar handwriting. Something about this didn't fit. Not with the official narrative of a routine patrol gone wrong. Not with the accident report that had been filed with vague language about instrument failure and adverse weather conditions. Why had Sarah's notebook emphasized the phrase, "prove it"? What had she needed to prove? And more troubling, why did Margaret's phone call to the Air Force Casualty Assistance Officer asking for more details about the incident yield nothing but polite deflection and assurances that a full report would be filed in due time? Margaret Chen had spent 50 years in the medical field learning to recognize when something was wrong with a patient. She had learned to trust her instincts, to see past what people wanted her to accept and look for the truth underneath. 2 months after Sarah's funeral, Margaret made a decision that her friends and family thought was unwise. At 73 years old, she began to investigate what had really happened on the day her daughter died. She started with the official accident report. It arrived in a manila envelope stamped with military seals. The document was 23 pages long, heavily redacted with black marker through several crucial sections. What remained was a bare-bones narrative. Pilot error, instrument failure, adverse weather conditions, aircraft went down, search and rescue teams could not locate crash debris. The redacted sections bothered her most. There was something important in those blacked-out lines. She could feel it. Margaret had a friend named Patricia who was married to a retired Air Force officer. Patricia invited Margaret over for coffee. And over the kitchen table, Margaret asked questions she had never thought to ask before. "These redactions," Margaret said, pointing to the thick black lines. "What would justify keeping information from the family?" Patricia's husband, Robert, adjusted his glasses as he examined the document. He was 75, quiet and thoughtful. He had spent 30 years as a logistics officer, which meant he understood military bureaucracy intimately. "National security concerns," he said slowly. "Or a classified operation. If the aircraft went down in a sensitive area or was involved in something classified, they might be restricted from releasing details." "But Sarah was just flying a routine patrol," Margaret said. "It was supposed to be surveillance, routine." Robert and Patricia exchanged a look that Margaret couldn't quite read. "Maybe it wasn't routine," Robert said. "Or maybe it was supposed to be routine, but something else happened." He told her about a researcher at a local university who specialized in military transparency and FOIA requests, Freedom of Information Act. Robert made a call on Margaret's behalf. Dr. James Reeves was a professor of political science in his 50s, with sharp eyes and the kind of determined persistence that Margaret recognized immediately. When she explained her situation, he listened carefully and asked detailed questions about the timeline, the location, the weather conditions. "The A-10 has one of the best safety records in military aviation," he said. "They're practically indestructible. The fact that one went down without any recovered debris is unusual." "What do you mean, no debris?" Margaret asked. "The report doesn't specifically say wreckage wasn't recovered, but the language suggests extensive searching turned up nothing. That's odd. Usually you find something." Dr. Reeves agreed to file a FOIA request for all unredacted information related to the incident. He warned Margaret that the process could take months, possibly longer. But as a researcher, he had access to databases and resources that civilians didn't. In the meantime, Margaret did something that surprised herself. She drove up to Hollister Air Force Base. It was a 6-hour drive from Fresno through beautiful California landscape. She had taken this drive once before for Sarah's graduation from pilot training. That day had been warm and clear, and Sarah had been so happy. Margaret remembered her daughter pointing out the buildings where she had trained, walking her mother through the base with obvious pride. This time, Margaret didn't go through the main gate. Instead, she parked in a nearby diner parking lot just off base and walked into the establishment, a place called Hangar's End. It was decorated with aviation memorabilia, photos of aircraft, posters of famous pilots, a model of the Wright Flyer suspended from the ceiling. The waitress who served her coffee was a woman about Margaret's age, with kind eyes and the wearing-down look of someone who had worked service jobs for decades. "I'm looking for people who knew my daughter," Margaret said. "She was a pilot here, Captain Sarah Chen." The waitress's face changed. "Oh, honey, I heard about what happened to her. That was a tragedy. She came in here sometimes, always polite, usually alone." "Did you ever hear her talk about her work, about her flights?" "Not much. Pilots usually don't, you know, security reasons and all, but there was something I remember. She seemed, well, I guess frustrated is the word, not with the flying, but with the people around her. She mentioned something once about proving a point." It was the same phrase Sarah had used in her notebook. Over the next several weeks, Margaret made 5 more trips to Hollister. She interviewed maintenance personnel, other pilots, administrative staff. She ate at every diner within 20 miles. She cultivated relationships, asked questions, and listened carefully to what people said and what they didn't say. From a maintenance sergeant named Howard Foster, she learned that Sarah had been asking questions about a classified project in the weeks before her death. He wouldn't say what the project was. Even in retirement, he respected the security restrictions, but he confirmed that Sarah had been concerned about something. "She was a professional," Howard told Margaret over lunch at a small Mexican restaurant. "But she was also conscientious. I think she saw something that bothered her." From a pilot named Captain James Mitchell, Margaret learned that Sarah had mentioned unusual radar signatures on her patrol routes, things that didn't match the standard civilian or military traffic patterns. "She asked me about it," Mitchell told her. "I told her to drop it, told her it wasn't her job to investigate anomalies. That's what the higher-ups get paid to worry about. But Sarah, she didn't drop things." The picture that emerged from these conversations didn't quite fit the accident narrative. It suggested instead that Sarah had been investigating something classified, something that had frightened or concerned her enough to pursue it despite the risks. 3 months after Margaret began her investigation, Dr. Reeves called her with news. "I've gotten some preliminary information back," he said. His voice was careful. "It's limited and there are still significant redactions, but there's enough to suggest something unusual happened that day." Margaret drove to his office at the university. Dr. Reeves had a cluttered workspace filled with books, research papers, and computer monitors displaying various databases. "According to the unredacted portions of the report, the morning of your daughter's flight, there was unusual military aircraft activity detected on radar in the mountains northeast of the base," he explained. "The activity was detected by Sarah's flight, and she chose to investigate." "What kind of aircraft?" "That's where it gets complicated. The report lists it as unidentified military asset, unmarked, not registered in any standard military database accessible to base personnel." Margaret felt something crystallize in her chest. They were testing something, and Sarah found it. Possibly, the aircraft went down in the mountains in the cloud cover. Sarah's aircraft was struck by what the report indicates was a missile, though again, the details are heavily redacted. A missile, but Sarah was military, friendly aircraft. "Exactly," Dr. Reeves said. "Exactly, which raises the question, why would a U.S. military asset fire on a U.S. military aircraft?" The answer, Margaret realized with a chill, was the same one that explained all the redactions, all the deflections, all the vague language in the official report. Sarah had discovered something she wasn't supposed to know, and they had silenced her. The breakthrough came 4 months into Margaret's investigation, and it came from the most unexpected source: Sarah's wingman, Lieutenant Frank Parker. Parker had left the Air Force 2 weeks after Sarah's death, citing personal reasons. He moved back to his hometown of Stockton, California, about an hour and a half from Hollister. According to Dr. Reeves's research, Parker had been subpoenaed for a classified inquiry into the incident, but the results of that inquiry were never made public. Margaret found Parker's address through an online database and showed up at his house unannounced on a Tuesday morning in July. He answered the door in jeans and a gray shirt, his blonde hair longer than she had remembered from Sarah's funeral. For a moment his face showed shock, then something like guilt. "Mrs. Chen," he said, I didn't expect to see you." "May I come in?" Margaret asked. Her voice was quiet but firm. Parker hesitated, then stepped aside. His living room was modest, decorated without much personality. There was a photograph on the bookshelf of Parker in his flight suit, looking confident. But the young man who let Margaret into his home looked nothing like the pilot in that photo. He looked haunted. "I know what happened," Margaret said, sitting down without waiting for an invitation. "I've been investigating. I know about the classified project, the unmarked aircraft, and I know that Sarah was shot down. What I don't know is why the Air Force is covering it up." Parker's face went pale. He sat down slowly across from her. "Mrs. Chen, I can't talk about this. I signed documents, national security classifications, if I say anything." "My daughter is dead," Margaret said simply. "And the government is lying about why. I think you owe it to Sarah's memory to tell me the truth." What followed was a conversation that Parker had probably been waiting to have since the day the missile struck Sarah's aircraft. "It was supposed to be a test," Parker began slowly. "An experimental aircraft, classified project. We weren't supposed to know about it, but rumors travel fast. The aircraft was being developed in secret at a private facility up in the mountains. Cutting-edge avionics, experimental engines, some kind of new weapons system. The government wanted to test it away from the main base, away from public observation. But Sarah found it. Sarah found it. She was sharp, too sharp maybe. She saw a radar signature that didn't match any standard pattern and decided to investigate. I told her not to, told her to let it go. But that wasn't Sarah. She couldn't let anything go if she thought something was wrong." "What happened when she found the aircraft?" Parker looked away. "The aircraft was piloted by someone from the private contractor. I don't know who, some kind of test pilot in a classified program. When Sarah identified the unmarked aircraft and started getting closer, probably trying to get visual confirmation or call it in, the test pilot panicked. Maybe he was ordered to. Maybe he made a decision on his own. But he launched a missile. At a fellow American pilot." At a fellow American pilot, Parker repeated quietly. And nobody investigated. Nobody held anybody accountable. Oh, they investigated. Classified inquiry. But the conclusion was that the contractor wasn't liable because the aircraft was engaged in a classified operation with security restrictions. Sarah shouldn't have been investigating in that zone. The test pilot was acting under pressure. It was determined to be a tragic accident caused by miscommunication and bad circumstances. An accident that killed my daughter. Yes, ma'am. Margaret sat with that for a long moment. Why are you telling me this? You could go to prison for revealing classified information. Parker's eyes were red. Because she was a good pilot. Because she was just doing her job. Because every day since then, I've had to live with the fact that I saw her coffin get lowered into the ground while the people responsible for putting her there continue to work on their classified project like nothing happened. He reached over to the bookshelf and took down a laptop. I made copies, he said. Before I left the Air Force, the full classified report, the incident investigation file, everything. It's all encrypted, but it's all here. The Air Force will prosecute you for that. Probably, but Mrs. Chen, with all respect, your daughter was worth it. Margaret left Parker's house with the encrypted files and a phone number for a journalist who specialized in military corruption and classified program oversight. Her name was Rebecca Torres, and according to Parker, she had exposed several high-level military scandals over the past decade. The next day, Margaret met with Rebecca at a coffee shop in Sacramento. Rebecca was younger than Margaret had expected, perhaps in her mid-40s, with intense dark eyes and the focused energy of someone who had spent her career chasing truth. Margaret told her everything. The investigation, the redacted report, the classified project, Sarah's death. Rebecca listened without interrupting, occasionally taking notes. This is significant, Rebecca said when Margaret had finished. If what you're telling me is accurate, this is a story about government oversight failure, corporate contractor accountability, and a military cover-up. It's the kind of story that could have real consequences. Will you investigate it? Margaret asked. I'll need more than encrypted files that Lieutenant Parker has, Rebecca said carefully. I'll need official documentation, ideally from sources inside the military or the contractor itself. But I'll start making calls. I have sources. If there's something to this, I can find it. Over the next month, Rebecca worked her network. She called retired military officers, former government employees, and sources inside the contractor's organization. Slowly, a more complete picture began to emerge. The classified project was called Phantom Wing. It was a partnership between the Department of Defense and a private aerospace contractor called Meridian Defense Systems. The goal was to develop an unmanned aerial platform capable of independent targeting and engagement decisions. Essentially, a combat drone that could make kill decisions without human input. The test flight on the day Sarah died had been one of several conducted in secret over the mountains north of Hollister. The aircraft had been engaged in a test of its automated defensive systems when it detected Sarah's approaching A-10. The defensive system, operating with minimal human oversight, had identified the A-10 as a threat and launched a defensive missile. The missile hit its target. Sarah's A-10 went down, and the subsequent investigation had been designed not to determine accountability but to contain the incident. The story broke on a Monday morning in September, 7 months after Sarah's death. The headline on the front page of the Washington Post was stark and simple. Military cover-up in pilot's death. How classified project led to friendly fire tragedy. Rebecca Torres' investigative report laid out the entire sequence of events with meticulous detail. She included interviews with Lieutenant Parker, corroboration from 3 former Meridian Defense Systems employees, documentation from the classified project files, and statements from retired military officers who had reviewed the incident. The story revealed that Captain Sarah Chen had been shot down by an automated combat system that had not yet been tested against friendly aircraft. The subsequent investigation had deliberately misclassified her death as an accident caused by instrument failure and weather. And the Meridian Defense Systems contractor had been protected by government officials who had a vested interest in keeping the Phantom Wing project alive. The political consequences were immediate and severe. Congress launched hearings. The Secretary of Defense requested the resignation of 3 high-ranking military officials, including Colonel Marcus Webb, the commander of Sarah's squadron. Meridian Defense Systems lost its federal contracts and faced civil lawsuits from shareholders who had been misled about the safety record of the Phantom Wing project. But for Margaret Chen, the most important moment came when Dr. Reeves called her with a specific piece of information. "The military has issued a formal correction to Sarah's service record," he said. "She's no longer classified as killed in action due to accident. She's now classified as killed in action in service of her country, with special commendation for her vigilance and her commitment to military protocol." "What does that mean?" Margaret asked. "It means they've officially acknowledged what happened. It means Sarah's death is being recognized for what it really was, a casualty of her duty to protect and defend." The funeral service was held again, this time with a different tone and different attendees. Margaret sat in the same front row, but this time beside her were 20 members of Congress, military officials, and reporters. The base commander delivered a eulogy that spoke specifically about Sarah's courage in investigating the anomalous radar signature, her commitment to her mission, and the tragedy that had resulted from systemic failures and inadequate oversight. There were apologies, formal ones, from the Air Force, from the Department of Defense, from the contractor's former leadership. But the apology Margaret cared about most came from an unexpected source. Frank Parker approached her after the service, dressed in a civilian suit. He looked tired but more at peace than he had in their last meeting. "Mrs. Chen," he said, "I want you to know something. Sarah was the best pilot I ever flew with, and she was right to investigate that signature. She was doing exactly what we're supposed to do: stay aware, stay alert, protect the mission. I should have done it with her instead of telling her to drop it." "She was brave," Margaret said simply. "She was always brave, even when people didn't understand that." "The world understands it now," Parker said. Margaret looked around at the military officers, the congressmen, the journalists, and photographers. She thought about how it had taken her daughter's death to make the world see what she had always known, that Sarah Chen was extraordinary. The story continued to unfold over the following months. More revelations came to light about Phantom Wing. More failures in military oversight were exposed. Congressional legislation was proposed to increase civilian oversight of classified military projects and to mandate review processes for automated combat systems. But for Margaret, the most meaningful part of the revelation came from the letters she began to receive from other military women. They wrote to tell her about their own experiences being underestimated, mocked, and held to different standards than their male counterparts. They wrote about how Sarah's story had made it easier for them to speak up, to report discrimination, to insist on their right to be taken seriously as military professionals. One letter came from a young female pilot named Lieutenant Amanda Santos, currently stationed at Hollister Air Force Base. "Your daughter was a hero to me before I knew her name," Santos wrote. "Knowing what she did, knowing that she was willing to sacrifice everything for what she believed was right, that makes me believe I can do the same. Thank you for fighting to tell her story." Margaret kept that letter on her refrigerator. Every morning when she made her coffee, she saw it and remembered her daughter's handwriting in that notebook. "I know who I am, and if I ever get the chance to prove it, really prove it, I will." Sarah had proven it, not in the way she had wanted, not in the way that would have let her live a long and happy life. But she had proven it. The truth had emerged from the darkness, and her name would not be forgotten. 1 year after Sarah's death, Margaret received a call from Colonel Patricia Hayes, the new commander of Hollister Air Force Base. "Mrs. Chen, we'd like to invite you to a special dedication ceremony," Hayes said. "We're naming our main training building after Captain Sarah Chen. It's something we should have done a long time ago." The dedication was held on a clear morning in October, exactly 1 year to the day after Sarah's aircraft went down. Margaret stood in the ceremony, this time with her ex-husband David, and with Patricia and Robert, and with Dr. James Reeves. The military band played. The American flag was raised, and a bronze plaque was unveiled, mounted on the side of the training facility where Sarah had studied the fundamentals of flight over 15 years before. Captain Sarah Chen, pilot, professional, patriot, killed in service, never forgotten. After the formal ceremony, Margaret was asked to say a few words. She stood at the podium, looking out at the gathered crowd, and for the first time since Sarah's death, she allowed herself to cry. "My daughter was not perfect," Margaret began, her voice wavering slightly. She was human. She had doubts. She had fears. But she had something that's rare. She had the courage to speak up when she saw something wrong. She had the conviction to act according to her principles, even when doing so was dangerous. She paused, composing herself. We live in a time when it's easy to keep quiet, when it's safer to go along, to accept what we're told, to not ask difficult questions. But Sarah asked the difficult questions. And yes, she paid the ultimate price for that. But in doing so, she made the world better. She made the military better. She made it possible for other women to believe that they too could be pilots, that they could be warriors, that they could be leaders. Margaret looked down at the plaque. Sarah, I want you to know that we know the truth now. We know what you were trying to do, and we're sorry we didn't understand it while you were still here. But your legacy will live on. Your name will live on. And women who walk through this building will know that you walked here too. That's how I choose to remember you, not as a victim of injustice, but as a catalyst for change. The crowd was silent. Margaret stepped away from the podium and touched the plaque with her hand, letting her fingers rest on her daughter's name. That evening, Margaret returned to the small diner where she had first begun asking questions. Hangar's End was quiet, with only a few patrons. She sat in a booth and ordered coffee. The waitress, the same woman who had told her about Sarah coming in alone, recognized her and sat down across from her. She came in here one day about a week before, the waitress said. Sat right where you're sitting. She ordered coffee and pie, and she wrote something in a little notebook. I remember her looking out the window at the base, looking so serious, like she was thinking about something big. Margaret sipped her coffee and looked out that same window toward the base where her daughter had trained, had served, had made the ultimate sacrifice. The sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. And in that moment, Margaret thought she heard something, the distant sound of engines, powerful and steady. The sound of an A-10 Thunderbolt with its distinctive guttural roar. She knew rationally that it was probably just a passing aircraft, something coincidental. But in her heart, Margaret chose to believe it was something else. She chose to believe it was Sarah, one final time, coming home. The radar had picked up one lone A-10 coming home, and the world would never forget why.